Everyone knows the story about the tortoise and the hare. The basic idea being that slow and steady wins the race. But what happens if I were to tell you that's not true? Where repetition, even for a prolonged period, doesn't actually lead to success. And so I want to tell you about a story where tradition didn't prevail. Once upon a time, around the mid-1990s, there were two countries in a serious drug epidemic. And even though they had been facing this problem for quite some time, they knew that it was a turning point because they saw a rise in three unusual activities: the amount of violent crime that was occurring, the amount of kids that were dropping out of high school, and the amount of general drug-related activity that was occurring. And so these two countries, they knew that they had to take some type of approach. So country A came out, and they decided that we're going to take a hardline approach. We're going to increase the amount of people that are in our police force. We're going to make our punishments greater. And if things got really crazy, they were even going to institute a curfew. And so country B, they thought about that and had their own decision. And so in 2001, country B decided that they were going to do a different approach. They were going to decriminalize all the drugs on the market. And I know what you're thinking. That's crazy. Why would they ever do that? But what happens if it was so crazy that it worked? And nearly 20 years later, while the US struggles with all those three issues, Portugal has seen a significant drop in all of them. This is an example of a counterintuitive policy, an idea or a measure that seems irrational on the surface, but once it's been implemented, it actually makes a lot more sense and seems like an innovative approach of tackling the solution. And so I want to give you another example on a smaller scale, one that actually involves our school. Dr. D, our principal, has been teaching IB philosophy for quite some time, and he's pretty good at it. His students do relatively well on the annual IB philosophy exam, getting anywhere in between a 4 and a 6 out of 7. But he knew that they could be doing a little bit better. And so we had a couple of options. Maybe he could add some more homework, or maybe he could add another book, or maybe he could just make more videos, right? So more knowledge equals better results, and that makes sense. But he decided he was going to go a completely different approach. He was going to go the opposite way. And so he decided that he was going to eliminate homework for 3 months and take out 2 of the 7 books from the course. And what happened? He saw results immediately. Kids were getting better grades, anywhere between 5 and 7, and leaning toward the higher side. And so I want to use Dr. D's example as a paradigm for how you might derive a counterintuitive policy altogether. And so the first part is breaking down the problem. And this is really important because this is where you're going to get your grassroots understanding and understand all the parties involved. And in this case, it wasn't just the teacher, the exam, and the student. It was the other things, how the teacher taught the course, or how the student was going about learning philosophy. And so you go on to your next step, setting a broad goal. And this is really important because counterintuitive policies work best under fewer limitations. And so the ultimate approach for Dr. D wasn't necessarily, how am I going to improve my teaching method, but how can I answer the ultimate question? How can I prepare my students for this exam? And so we went on to the next part, evaluating the parties involved. And this was different from the first, breaking down the problem, because you had to understand the other key players, like the other exams that the students had to take, or their social life, or just in general, their timing. And so we had to consider that. And so we went on to the next step, assessing the space for risk. And a lot of you might think that Dr. D's choice to eliminate homework was actually really irrational. Why would less work translate to better grades? But when I asked him about it, his logic was that since the students had less material, they could master it and then better relate on the exam, getting the better grade. And that makes sense. But that's exactly what a counterintuitive policy is. Something that seems irrational on the surface, but once you look deeper, it's actually a really innovative way of tackling a problem. And so I want to give you another example, back on the macro scale. This cartoon illustrates how corruption has significantly hurt India, how bureaucracy has fostered a corrupt environment. And so in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a choice to make. How is he going to handle this situation? And so we had a couple of options. Maybe he could initiate an anti-corruption investigation. Or maybe he'd go more along the lines of creating more transparency. Or third option, maybe he could implement an anti-corruption task force. Any of those things seem reasonable, right? And traditionally they have worked. But what he decided to do was change the currency altogether. So he took the $50 and $100 equivalents, the 500,000 rupees, and exchanged them. And what happened? Politicians came flooding in, exchanging their 1,000 rupees for 100 at 10% the rate. But just think about that on the massive scale. It minimized corruption to a great degree. And so some of you might be thinking, well, it's great that it worked for India, that it worked for Portugal, and it's great that it worked for Dr. D. But how do I know that it can work for us right now? And so I decided to pick 3 issues today, ones that were important to me both about my life inside and outside of school. And so it was education, unemployment, and guns. And these issues were generally independent of each other and had a different dialogue surrounding each issue, making it a little bit more difficult. And so the way I went about tackling these problems wasn't necessarily about how I can improve the current system, but how I can answer the ultimate question. And so in the case of education, the question was, how can we construct the most productive learning experience? And so when I came about my research, I saw the flipped classroom model. The basic idea being that students go home to learn through videos or books, and then come to school and maximize their time with their teacher. And even though it seems rather counterintuitive on the surface, why would this work? Well, basically, it answers the ultimate question. How can we construct the most productive learning experience? Because it tailors education on a personal level. It makes learning more conducive to the person and makes it that much more special. And so I went on to my next problem, unemployment. And the ultimate question about unemployment wasn't necessarily how can we get people into jobs right now, but how can we make sure that they have some sense of job security? And so one of my propositions that I saw came about in especially parts in Southeast Asia was where companies were incentivized into moving into volatile areas. And they did so by giving them tax breaks. And not only was this productive for the government because it provided stability for these communities, it was actually a symbiotic relationship for the companies as well, now that they were able to earn more profit. And so they were able to foster a sense of stability within their communities because they raised wages, they gave their citizens a sense of job security, and ultimately they uplifted those communities, making it productive for both the environment and the country. And so guns. This was a really tough problem because the issue on guns wasn't necessarily one that we could determine. It wasn't like arithmetic. It was more about the dialogue and ideologies. And so the ultimate question was, how can we foster a safer environment? And so one of the solutions I came upon was the idea of changing the whole concept of what it means to have a gun. From changing it from a lethal force to a non-lethal force. How? By changing the bullet altogether. Taking a standard lead bullet and changing it into a rubber bullet, something that we've seen in other countries through riot control. And it's not necessarily just a solution that I want you to think about, but the whole ideology behind it. What happens if we could change the concept altogether? What happens if we can shift the culture so that we challenge the status quo? And that's exactly why counterintuitive policy works, because it does challenge the status quo and changes the way that citizens have to think about a problem. And so I want to leave you with this cartoon that reads, "This really is an innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it. It's never been done before." And it's funny, because this is the problem that I always see, that we're afraid about what we can and can't do. But my argument is not necessarily that we know what we can and can't do, because we can do a lot. We have that much power. But the real challenge is knowing how we can use that power responsibly. And so bringing it back full circle about Portugal, a lot of you might think that Portugal made an irresponsible decision about decriminalizing drugs. But what they knew, that America didn't at the time, that it wasn't necessarily the drugs that were the problem. It was the idea of the drugs. They challenged the status quo. And my proposition is that we do the same thing. We change the culture and we change our traditions so that we can foster a better and brighter future. Thank you.